Good morning, everybody. First, I want to thank Dr. Bryce and the good folks here at Highline for having us back. Or for me and Dr. Bolden, it's our return trip, and we finally did, as was mentioned, get our third colleague back and have what we've affectionately called the Killer Bees Squad. Ball, Bolden, Burroughs. Okay. So again, I'm Jared Ball, and for my contribution to this collective, a lot of the focus of my own work is brought to this, and which is sort of a combination of my academic training in Africana and then media studies, with the sort of unofficial training from political education and what is loosely referred to as the Black radical tradition. And before I get even more started here, I do want to first invite everybody to, anyway, I wanted to start with a quick shout out to our collective website known as imixwhatilike.org, and invite you all to not only check out all of the content, but in particular, the first episode we did, and I don't want to go too far again, but the first episode we did of Academics in Cars. So if some of you are familiar with like the Jerry Seinfeld, comedians in cars having coffee and stuff like that, and people doing freestyle rhymes in cars, well, we've just done an Academics in Cars version. And the first episode starts with us literally leaving the theater after first seeing this film and having our first conversation about it. So I want to invite you all to check it out. And much more of the work that we all do and our extended networks do, which I think you'll enjoy. So that said, I'm going to put a quick timer on here because I'm not going to take more than 10 minutes here to lay out my initial thoughts, and then we're going to come back, as was said, for a more collective presentation and conversation. But I think it's always important to always start with the fact that media are best understood as ideological weaponry in service of a particular political function. And if you ever take your time, if you haven't already, to endeavor a study into the origins of this country's academic approach to the study of communication, it's all very clear in the documentation. What was the purpose? The purpose was initially create new citizens out of European immigrants and train existing non-white people to be non-white and to always know their place as non-white and subservient, and to teach WASPs basically that they are superior. And that general function has pretty much proceeded unended up until today. And in terms of, particularly as we talk about the internet and digital technology, much like all media technology, we should always remember, particularly in the context of this country, their military origins. So whether it's, radio, certainly the internet, and even television had a very military component to it in terms of its delivery of messages, its purpose as a commercial product, and deploying the very techniques developed to propagandize people in other countries to do the same work here for those internally held. Some of us describe it as colonies or subjects as opposed to citizens in a democracy. And that there has always been a parallel, even in terms of definition and function, between propaganda, public relations, and psychological warfare. So there should be an evolving recognition, particularly as we move into 21st century, further into 21st century, of the military function of everything in our media environment, from trying to convince us to buy a certain shoe or car, to have to go to a certain film, or to have a certain political worldview. There has been a particular understanding for those interested in the study of propaganda, and if you really just think about it, Demos is the organization, I think, and Oxfam reported recently that 1% of the world's population is worth more than the rest of the world combined. I just start with that broad description because if you want to maintain that level of inequality, particularly if you are in the 1% or the 1/10 of 1% that really own everything, the number one mechanism or method for maintaining that inequality is to convince people that it's either natural, normal, of their own fault, or that those who are in that 1% are there because they've worked hard and deserve it. So that there has been an immeasurable effort deployed historically to manage people's perception of the world using propaganda, using popular culture in particular, as a mechanism to manage the social inequalities that continue to worsen. So historically, when black people rebel, there are more black people put on TV and in film. And if you look now, and I haven't done this, anybody maybe can, I'm happy to discuss this with anybody. I have an unfinished project where I've just been starting to look at the change in the token Negro over the last 30 to 40 years. And the token Negro is becoming more of a token Asian or a token Indian or token LGBTQ. And the purpose is the same. Any group that might potentially be threatening must be brought in through tokenism. And so now that black people have theoretically had their problems solved, after Obama in particular, right? Everything's good, right? More or less, right? There needs to be a new tokenism encouraged so that other aggrieved communities feel less threatened and less distanced by this. But it's something that we always have to be careful of, that is, as Harold Cruz once asked, what happens when an oppressed community is brought into the cultural store of their oppressor? There is similarly, I want to make I just put out a point here about, there's a similar confusion around the concept of entertainment. More so in this country, I think, than anywhere else in the world, and which is logical, because nowhere else in the world have we seen the sophisticated development of a propaganda system like we have in this country. We are the most highly propagandized population in the world. You have, at no point in human history have you had a greater concentration of control over popular culture in the hands of a few than we do today. And people have been talking for decades about how what will allow the United States to exist as an empire longer than previous empires of the past is because this country's control over popular culture and digital technologies in this country and around the world, convincing people that things are better than they actually are, despite people's lived experience. If you can actually go outside and be beaten and shot and live in poverty, but then somehow be convinced after 2 hours in a film that there's a greater horizon, things are all good. So when I look at how many black people in particular are excited to come out of a Black Panther film, I feel like doing the Malcolm X routine when he was catching people coming out of church. All day in the preacher's seat, and you still come out here. This is what's still going on. Don't get too excited about what you saw on screen or heard in the pulpit, because then you still got to come out here. Anyway. As to the film itself, I think it's always important, not only in particular to look at the relationship of film to propaganda, and it has long been understood that film in particular is dangerous because, starting with the captive audience, and for those of us who are over probably, I guess, the age of 40 at this point, we have seen the shift, and those older than that have even seen the shifts beyond that, where you could have at one point gone to a movie theater and for 10 cents seen newsreels and movies all day and all afternoon. Then it gets more expensive. When my generation came in, at least when you went to the theater, you had a chance to talk to someone you were with before the films and the previews started, but now that's even gone. And your generation is propagandized from the moment you walk into the building. Captive audience. Sit down. Now they have commercials and not just previews for films, but commercials and games to play. You can't even sit and talk to anybody anymore while you're waiting for the film. The captive audience experience is meant to begin from the moment you walk in to the time you leave. Then it gets darker, the huge screen, the Dolby surround sound, and you are completely locked in a sensory environment and bombarded with images that are then dismissed or weakened by this concept that is propagated that it's just entertainment. And we're told, the first criticism I get when I offer my thoughts, the first thing people say to me is, man, it's just a movie, it's just a song, it's just a book, it's just entertainment, and we don't recognize intentionally by design that there has been a lot of effort put into denying the role of entertainment in constructing a consciousness for us. So as I often say to my students, borrowing from a professor I once had that I disagreed with all the way through, except for this. Remember Professor Richardson at Frostburg? We disagreed about everything, but he said one thing that I always appreciated. He said, you have to interrogate your preferences. I soften that to mean you have to ask yourself, why do I like what I like, and how do I know what I know? And you have to be more critical of it when you like it. So if you liked Black Panther, given the context of what this country is doing, given the context of political and social and material inequality, given the context of white supremacist images and anti-blackness in this country, you have to ask yourself, if I am delivered something from the mainstream institutions that I like, I should be suspicious. What is it doing that I like? What did I like in that film? Because those who create the media that targets us, they have conducted those studies. As Dr. Burroughs said, what will people like? Well, black people, brown people want some more images. Black women want some more black women. Let's throw some black women in there. Let's let them even take a wig off and make it seem like it's some, advance in terms of African beauty. Let's throw some things at them. And this has historically been written about and documented. This isn't just Dr. Ball coming up with this. If you go back and look at the history of the Kerner Commission, we just had the 50th anniversary of, it said, basically, you want to help make black people feel less likely to rebel? Put them more on TV. Hire a few more black journalists. So my generation grew up with some more black journalists. And we had What's Happening in Sanford and Son and Good Times, right? Follow the trend. Written, directed, produced by whites, mostly men with money, for a black audience to be less likely to see the contradictions and to rebel. And then here we are in 2018 with a film produced, largely written by or initially developed by, certainly distributed by and benefited mostly in terms of the money generated, white male-dominated companies with conglomerate connections to international business and relationships all around the world that have none of our interests at heart. Please. No! It's like...
To show how insidious this can be, right? When the Black Panther movie came out, one of the first things I heard was, okay, Disney's making all of this money. Should we demand that Disney give us some of this money? Right? Black community, people in the black community were asking this. Disney, understanding human psychology the way they do, announced 2 weeks later that they were going to open STEM centers in major American cities. Now, they're opening STEM centers because they're talking about the Afrofuturist vision of the movie. And they found, with their very quick analytics, that Shuri was one of the most popular characters that people were talking about coming out of the movie. So they said, okay, let's set up something where we can claim that we are training the next generation of black and brown children to be like Shuri. Now, the fact that they did this only 2 weeks after the movie came out means that they understood our mentality and understood what we would ask for, and what would put Pavlov to shame, they gave us something before we barely asked for it. This is the power of the Disney Corporation. And this is how oppressed people are studied, to the point where one of our problems politically in 2018 is that there are no more new situations for them to study in terms of how we respond to something. They know every single response we're going to make to every single action. So we can't produce something new that frightens them so we can get concessions or revolution, because there is now nothing new to produce, because they have figured out every single response we're ever going to make. So Disney knew immediately to respond with something that would stop people from asking those questions. So,
Okay, thank you. So just a few more points from me, at least at this initial point, that I just wanted to make very quickly. So just again, we'll come back to this, but try to be careful with this concept of entertainment. It has been developed over a long time to confuse people into thinking, to lull us into a false sense of security. And then, as I wanted to also quickly point out here, there's a great deal of under-discussed literature on the relationship between intelligence agencies like the CIA and managing our public sphere. So this isn't, again, about being conspiratorial, although as Ishmael Reed quite accurately said. Okay. Or like Ishmael Reed said about conspiracies, if you want to call me a conspiracy theorist, you just have to acknowledge yourself as a coincidence. Thank you. So in a great book that I like to quote from all the time by Frances Stoner Saunders, she talks about what not just the intelligence agencies of this country, but working with their colleagues in England and the West did over the last 50, 60 years, which was to create, well, this was actually longer than, well, over a 50, 60 year period starting in the early 20th century, to fight against the growing tendency, particularly among oppressed people, towards communism, to use public sphere and entertainment to convince people that communism and socialism were bad and that capitalism was good and American democracy could only function under a capitalist economy. So what they said was, and I'll paraphrase this quote that she said, she spoke to one of Jay Epstein was his name, a guy who's actually considered to be part of the liberal left and a publisher of so-called progressives. But as he said himself, he was part of the left wing of the anti-communist bloc. And he was one of the people positioned at high levels of publication, not to tell people, you must write what I tell you to write to be published, but simply to set up, as they said, a facetious set of criteria that would, by definition, determine the kinds of people that would apply or be accepted or fit within the mission that they wanted. So when you look at popular culture today, and when you look at popular punditry in academia or anything today, especially when you like it, start to ask yourself, again, why do I like what I'm hearing or reading or seeing? But also, how is it that these are the people that got placed there and not someone else? And this isn't just a question of talent, because obviously there are plenty of talented people that we all know in various fields that are not super famous. This is a question of who fits the criteria that has been established by those in power who want certain forms of discussion more popular than others. And in my last piece that Dr. Burroughs sort of touched on here, first of all, you should all get this book. I won't have time to really get into it, but it's a fascinating critique of how Disney comic books teach people from a very young age things like imperialism is good, white people are better than black people, women are bad, or at least inferior, or at least only useful when connected to a male, that kind of thing. And so on and so forth, and that there's a lot more going on in comics, and in particular because comics have a way of reaching young minds, particularly when depicted as animals and not human beings. Messages are much more easily distilled. But the real point about the film that I wanted to make, I thought we had it right there. The point that Dr. Burroughs pointed out about the STEM programs and nonprofit solutions to intentional economic and social problems. Dr. Burroughs mentioned that there was some attempt at the early development of the character, the Black Panther character in the Marvel comic, to have him be a non-sort of radical, non-black liberation figure. Patrice Lumumba on the left here, the only democratically elected leader of the Congo, who was that spoken of figure that T'Challa was initially meant to represent the opposite of. The reason we put this in here is because in 1960, Lumumba goes with the same kind of sash that you see T'Challa wear in the film to the UN to give a speech about what his newly free and independent country, the Congo, was going to do. And in that speech, he tells the West, your days of imperial power are over, colonialism is over, our resources are going to be used for us and for other Africans oppressed, and you all are going to have to go. Immediately, literally before his speech was over, Western powers were conspiring to assassinate him, and within 365 days of that address, he was assassinated and replaced by a CIA-preferred leader in the Congo. Here we have T'Challa at the end of Black Panther come and give a very similar speech, wearing, again, I think not coincidentally, a similar style sash. He comes to the UN to tell the new world that he is entering, at least, that they are there, that they have the technology, and that they're going to give it over to everybody. And then he gives that knowing and smiling nod to the white CIA agent in the back of the room. That, to me, was the sort of the final straw, the most obvious point that the film was making politically to I think, propagandize us with what this film is intending to do. That is, to create a new Pan-Africanism that isn't really Pan-African, to create a radical, or to create a Pan-Africanism that isn't really radical, that isn't the form that existed in real life, to take us away from not only that politics that informed Lumumba, but informed the Black Panther Party of which has most popularly delivered upon us the symbol that this film is looking to reclaim, and leaves us with the idea, as the film says at the very end, that a spaceship will come down into the hood and deliver you a nonprofit art center, and that will be the end of your oppression. The very last thing I'll say about that is we do have to understand that this was the very Nixonian plan in the 1970s to replace black liberation with nonprofits. I mean, this was exactly what was done on purpose, which is why so much of our so-called activist world is a nonprofit society, and why, coincidentally, I would argue so little has changed materially. All right, I will stop there. Dr. Bolden will take it from oh, sure.
A lot of you had a lot of heavy concepts, sure, and a lot of academic language, and there are a lot of us in the room that are from underserved communities, and I just want to, could you kind of, give us a snapshot and, break down so that, we get some of the messages?
Sure. The film is not a film for those looking for radical revolutionary change. The film is meant to take the energy that we see in the streets with Black Lives Matter or any other forms of protest, and to say, don't be angry like a Lumumba, don't tap into your radical traditions and look to radical institutional challenges to the system, the problems that you face on a daily basis. Look to align yourselves with those in power who are creating this problem, and then look for solutions to your problems that those in power want you to find.
So if I could just interrupt again,
sure.
because again, I love everything about the movie but the politics. The problem is the movie's about the politics. You have a movie about an African country in which no black person says the word Africa, with the exception of the narrator in the very beginning, the guy who gets killed. He's the only person that says that. He's the only black person who says the word Africa in the movie. Africa is mentioned by the white characters. We have a film in which Wakandans only talk about Wakanda and the world. They never talk about Africa. And that's purposely done because if they talked about Africa, then they would have common ground with Killmonger. And then they would have worked out something. Like if T'Challa had made that speech to the African Union, that would have been a completely different movie. Had T'Challa and Killmonger said, well, look, what if I give you control over Africa and you can build up Africa and you can have a real African Union, there'd have been no battle. And Killmonger would not have been the quote-unquote bad guy he is in the movie. But there had to be a battle because there had to be a victory because there had to be an accommodation to the world. And now on Friday we're going to see where all the white characters, 2/3 of the movie goes, well, we don't know what to do. And so they're going to go to Africa. The whole last third of this movie is in Wakanda. You're going to see all the Black Panther characters again on Friday. It's the last third of the movie, and you're going to see them because the white characters need help.
The help.
The help. Go ahead. Just briefly, they need the help, right?